Hello, I'm John Trimbos, and this is part 2 of a 6-part modular program of webinars about writing and drafting and proofreading skills. If you've come straight to this from and not seen part 1, well then stop it this minute and go back and watch part 1 first, because everything I say may not make that much sense, but it probably will, but it'll make a lot more sense if you look at part 1 first and then move on to this session afterwards. So last time we were looking at the whole idea of writing and drafting in plain English, trying to express ourselves as clearly and succinctly as possible. And we have a workbook. It's the same workbook as last time. Here it is. We had just finished doing a tabulation exercise. So the main points from session 1, sentence length, favor the active voice, tabulate wherever necessary or appropriate, and certainly if you have 3 items or more in the list in a series, then I really would strongly recommend that you tabulate sentences. Now, kicking off this session, we're just going to recap on a couple of points from session 1. So part 4 of the handout, use the active voice rather than the passive voice. As we have seen, the passive tends to be more verbose than the active voice. And also I showed you how the actor can fall off the end of a sentence by mistake. And then, of course, you can end up with a sentence that is extremely vague by mistake, which of course we generally don't want. Having said that, there are times when you might have to be a little bit vague, or you might choose to be a bit vague in the interest of diplomacy. So like if you look at 4b there, it is considered that insufficient steps are being taken to avoid loss. Who considers this? Who's taking the steps? Who's causing the loss? Well, we have the faintest idea. And that's what tends to happen with the passive voice. However, supposing you want to give your client negative feedback about their failure to instruct you properly or something, then in the active voice, I mean, I suppose it can be a little bit too clear really sometimes, can't it? So, you know, you or your people have not always instructed us on time, or not always given us clear and timely instructions. You could, on the other hand, take a strategic view to go into the passive voice and say, well, instructions have not always been received in the most timely manner. It's a little bit more diplomatic, I suppose. Politicians, of course, use the passive a lot. So that quote from Gordon Brown, I wrote that when I updated these notes after the credit crunch of 2009. Mistakes have been made. I seem to remember members of the current government using similar expressions following the handling of the coronavirus and things like that. So that is not a party political statement at all. And then having said, well, you can use the odd bit of passive. If you look in part C there are times when the active voice can look a little bit artificial maybe. So this is where you can use the passive. So number 1, where the actor is unknown or indefinite, the shop was burgled. You could say a burglar has burgled the shop, but that really doesn't add anything to our sum of knowledge. Secondly, where the action is more important than the actor. So it could be the service of legal proceedings, or a referendum has been called, or something like that. And then what's often called the detached abstraction, which is where you talk in general abstract terms about whole species or populations or classes of people. All children are created with a thirst for knowledge. You know, those are all passive sentences, but they kind of work. So be pragmatic. But the general guideline is at least 9 times out of 10 use the active voice because it's shorter and clearer. And then when we move into legal drafting modes, then I will be stricter and I will say stay in the active voice all the time, but that's really for legal documents. What we're still talking about now, of course, is general business correspondence and so on. Another issue that we touched on last time is the idea of using the base verb rather than the derivative form using a noun, like complain instead of make a complaint, say decide instead of arrive at a decision, come and present your findings to the board rather than deliver a presentation of your findings, and so on. I always think of my younger son when I look at the last item on the list there, conclude rather than draw a conclusion. He is just finishing a history degree. up at the University of Edinburgh, and he has throughout his academic career turned to me for help with editing documents because he has a habit of overshooting the word count for essays and things like that. And true to form, his thesis for his history degree, the word limit was 12,000 words, and he had diligently got it down to 12,500, and then he emailed me and he said, I'm stuck. I've managed to get rid of at least 1,000 surplus words here, but I'm totally stuck now. Can you have a look? And it's always a good idea, really, to get someone maybe to look at things with a fresh eye, because you might see things that the author doesn't. And yeah, I read through it and it was very interesting. It read very nicely, but he still has two bad habits. The first one is the passive voice. And I'm sure that's a habit that he picked up from reading his academic history books. So I took all his passive sentences and put them into the active voice, and that got me most of the way there. I think that got rid of 400 words straight away. And then his other habit is he loves the phrase draw the conclusion. We can therefore draw the conclusion from the evidence that, and I changed every one of those to conclude, so I used one word instead of 3 or 4, and that got me over the line. In fact, I was watching very carefully the word count thing at the bottom left hand of my computer screen, and I got it down to 12,000 words exactly, which I thought was very elegant. So I emailed the 12,000 word edit back to him, which he was very pleased with. So yeah, it's interesting, isn't it? Academic thesis, at least 500 words, said absolutely nothing whatsoever. Kind of decluttering you can achieve. Now, apart from using one word instead of 3 or 4, using the base verb is reckoned to be a good idea, because all the professional writing guides say that if you want to write with a lot of punch, with a lot of impact, then you really should put as many verbs into your writing as possible, because verbs are action words, aren't they? And the idea is that if the reader takes in lots of action words, then that has a much stronger impact on the reader's mind. So in this case, I mean, if we look at the example in 5b there, in this case, we're rattling our saber at the other side. We are in sympathy with your point of view, but if it is your aim to cause a prolonging of our discussions, we will draw the conclusion that you do not want to enter into an agreement and will take the necessary action to enter into negotiations with other interested parties. There's a strong message in there, isn't there? But it's kind of got lost in this forest of surplus words because it's all written in the derivative form using a noun, and it's much too long. So if we take out the derivative forms and we put in base verbs, well, first of all, the sentence will be much more towards the 25-word mark, so much more acceptable sentence length. But this will be a lot stronger as well. And yeah, as you write, think about the verbs that you use, because we could, I suppose, start off with we sympathize with your point of view. But it's a bit nice, isn't it? You know, you could use a different verb. You could say we understand your point of view, or we note your point of view. So we note your point of view, but if you prolong discussions, we'll conclude you don't want to agree terms, and we will negotiate with somebody else. Or we will negotiate with lots of other people, or we will negotiate with your main competitor. That's much stronger, isn't it? You know, there's a lot more punch to that writing style. So in this case, we're trying to be a bit threatening. It could be that you just want to write very strong advice to the client. You know, I really think you need to do this. So, you know, use the base verb there. Or it could be that you're pitching for work, as you will do. And if you want to convey lots of energy and enthusiasm to win business, use as many verbs as you can again, and that will seriously strengthen your writing style. Right, moving on, 2 issues on the next page. So what I've said is be aware of jargon and elegant variations of language. I have not said don't use jargon and elegant variations of language. I'm saying be aware of them and be very, very careful. Treat with extreme suspicion. Legal jargon depends very much on the reader. And if you are going to use legal jargon, especially Latin legal jargon, then you've got to be absolutely sure about the reader. So if you're corresponding with other law firms, okay. If your client is in-house counsel, that's okay as well. But you really have got to be careful, because some of these expressions do not travel well. They do not travel across professional boundaries, and they do not travel internationally. But yeah, if you're sure about the reader, then yeah, why not? Because a lot of these legal expressions, they do actually compress quite lengthy ideas into short, pithy little expressions, like, for example, mutatis mutandis, with all the necessary and appropriate changes. That boils 7 words down into 2. So, fine, but used with extreme discretion. And as an example of one that does not travel terribly well, rather surprisingly, is the one mentioned in numbered part 2 there, ultra vires, very common sort of expression we use in this country. I think it's really tends to be prevalent in common law jurisdictions. Anyway, I put it into the notes for 2 reasons. One reason is quite old, and the other reason is much more recent. So the old reason is going back to my fee earning days. So I mentioned in part 1 that I was a property lawyer. I actually specialized into planning and environmental law, and I practiced in that for about 10 years. And back in my fee earning days, I can remember emailing a senior chartered town planner working for one of the London boroughs, and I'd suggested that something in a draft planning agreement was potentially ultra vires, and she rang me up to talk about it. And towards the end of the call, she said, well, I need to go and talk to various people, but I'll email you back as soon as possible, but it won't be today. And in fact, regardless of everybody else's availability, I probably couldn't email you back today anyway, because our whole computer system crashed first thing this morning. Apparently, it's become infected. I wonder if it might have this ultra-virus thing that you mentioned. And I said, well, it may well do, but that's not quite what I meant. And then we talked about ultra vires, and she had never heard that expression in her life. And the thing is, I would have thought somebody like a town planner working for a public sector body like a London borough would have been familiar with the phrase ultra vires, but absolutely not. Now, more recently, as you know, I've changed career and I now run training and stuff for a living. And before the COVID pandemic, amazingly, I used to get paid to travel all over Europe and Asia to run training courses. I suspect the rest of my life is going to be spent on Zoom rather than traveling, which is a mixed blessing. But anyway, the last time I was in Paris, this was an in-house legal team, and we were going through this, and I said nothing about the meaning of ultra vires whatsoever. And right on cue, most of the French lawyers immediately said, what's that? What's that expression? Don't know that. Explain, please. And I had a similar experience in Brussels. And then last year, I did a one-to-one coaching program for a German lawyer based in Munich. He works for a UK law firm, but in their Munich office. And I asked him, do you use the phrase ultra vires in Germany? And he said, no, what's that mean exactly? But I did a Zoom training session for the Johannesburg office of a huge international law firm. And I asked them, do you use the phrase ultra vires in South Africa? And they said, oh, yes, we do. It's unconstitutional. It's unlawful. It's beyond the scope of your legal powers. So ultra vires is mainstream terminology in the Horn of Africa, but it doesn't mean terribly much just the other side of the Channel Tunnel. That is a bit odd, actually, isn't it? That is a bit odd, but that is the way it is. So if you are dealing with lawyers in other jurisdictions, don't assume that they use the same jargon that we do, because they may not. And if in doubt, say it in plain English, even if you have to use 6 words rather than 2. Now, elegant variations of language. These are drummed into us at school. I bet you can remember a school teacher saying something like, don't use the same word over and over again. It's really boring. It's monotonous. Try and use lots of different language in your writing to make it interesting. And in principle, I don't have a problem with that. I mean, we are talking about general business writing, writing correspondence to clients and so on. And as long as you're careful, I think that's absolutely fine. Now, let's have a look at the first example in part 3 there. This is a bit silly in one sentence, but we're talking about settling out of court. The first action was settled for £20,000. The second item of litigation was disposed of for £25,000, while the settlement reached in the third case was £30,000. Bit silly in one sentence, but if you can imagine those different expressions in different sentences scattered throughout a long advice letter or something, well, yeah, I think that's perfectly okay. And yes, as long as you're careful. And certainly if you do need to maintain reader interest through a lengthy document, two classic ways to achieve this are, first of all, have a mixture of longer and shorter sentences. So don't have a sort of uniform sentence length, because that's a bit monotonous as well. So a mixture of longer and shorter sentences, and then a mixture of vocabulary. Maybe have longer and shorter words as well. And those are two key ways to maintain reader interest, but as long as you're careful. So that example is relatively harmless, although a bit strange in one sentence. The second example, though, is, now this is nudging into legal drafting territory. So this is kind of looking ahead to sessions 3 and 4, but, do bear this in mind as well when writing to clients. Clause 37 shall terminate this tenancy, whereupon A, all outstanding rents shall be paid immediately, and B, the tenant shall forthwith vacate the premises. Now, I've been running sessions using this booklet on Zoom for a couple of years now, and I always ask people just to type into the chat box yes or no, immediately and forthwith. We need to do something immediately. We need to do something forthwith. I ask people, do those words mean the same thing? In which case, type the word yes into the chat box in Zoom. Or do the words immediately and forthwith mean something a little bit different? In which case, type no, they mean something different. And I get yes, no, yeah, totally split opinion all the time. Now, behind me on the shelf is the Oxford English Dictionary, and I did look them up just to be on the safe side. And immediately and forthwith are listed together and interchangeably. So immediately, forthwith, straight away, at once, now, as soon as possible. Yeah, I think they kind of mean the same thing, like now. The tenancy is finished, so this needs to happen now, as soon as humanly possible. But of course, what you don't want is a judge or an arbitrator looking at that and saying, subtly different language here, immediately and forthwith. So are they trying to say something subtly different? Is there some shade of meaning here? I don't think there is. I think it's like as soon as possible. And certainly if you're writing to clients and you're using kind of interchangeable words like that, just double check that the client won't think there's some kind of change of meaning or subtle nuance in what you're writing. The third example, I don't know what this is. This is an elegant non-variation of language or a variation of meaning. This is a rare case of the same word cropping up twice in a sentence, but having a different meaning. The judge gave no consideration to the defendant's argument that no consideration was given for the promise. Yeah, send that to one of your clients, see if they know what the hell you're talking about there. So different meaning, I would give it a different word. So I would either say the judge gave no consideration to the defendant's argument that no value was given for the promise, or the judge gave no weight to the defendant's argument that no consideration was given for the promise. That sentence is almost insane. And then the last one, Read the Willows. This was actually volunteered to me by a property lawyer who said, yeah, I did kind of mess up a bit here. So he was writing to the client about an investment property that his client had inherited. And yeah, Read the Willows, I'm writing to you in relation to the above property. As you are aware, a tenancy has been granted over the said property, and the demised property cannot now be sold unless it is subject to the said tenancy. And he said the client rang up and she said, what the hell is the demised property? What on earth are you talking about? And of course, it's the Willows all the way through, isn't it? So he was trying to write a nice, chatty, interesting letter. And in fact, he just ended up writing a rather strange and confusing one. So yeah, again, like I said, I mean, elegant variation. So I'm not saying don't. I'm just saying be very careful in general business writing mode. Again, though, when we go into legal drafting mode, so of course that's much more serious. So I said last time that when we go into legal drafting mode, I will tell you to stay in the active voice all the time to be on the safe side. And also for legal drafting, you have got to use the same word over and over again. I know it goes against the grain, but for consistency, you seriously do. Right, the next section is all about sentence construction, really, word order. And English is a very flexible language when it comes to word order, in a way that many other languages aren't. Now, my surname, Trimbos, is actually Dutch. My father was a Dutchman who emigrated to this country from Holland. And Dutch is a very strict Germanic language, and you really can't mess around with Dutch terribly much. You can't play around with Dutch word order or its ungrammatical Dutch. English is very different. It's much more fluid, and this can be good, and it can be a bit tricky as well. So the good idea, the nice idea is in part A here, which is that you can move words around in a sentence to give them emphasis. So version 1, the secretary's complaint is or consists of discrimination by the company. So that's the nature of her complaint. And that is typically how we would write an active voice sentence. But professional writers would say that if you want to emphasize a word or an idea, you move it to one end of the sentence. So you can front load it and it jumps out at the reader. Discrimination is the secretary's complaint against the company. Or you can move it to the back end of the sentence and it's the last word the reader takes in and it then sticks in the reader's mind. The secretary's complaint against the company is discrimination, like that. So that's a nice idea. Where you run into trouble, though, possibly, is if you add in descriptive or modifying words. Not always, but sometimes. So if we look at the first example in B2, a guardian who steals trust money frequently cannot be arrested. Yeah, there's the sensible way of reading it, but there is a slightly mad way as well. So I think it's trying to say that dishonest guardians frequently get away with it. But you could imagine a client maybe skimming through that a bit quickly. They might relate the frequently back to the stealing. So a guardian who steals trust money frequently cannot be arrested, whereas one who steals it once or twice a year can. That makes no logical sense whatsoever, but you can see the scope for confusion there. So I would personally clarify it by moving frequently to the front. Frequently, a guardian who steals trust money cannot be arrested. That's a much clearer word order. I don't think that's really open to misinterpretation. The second one, he said that you hit him. I mean, imagine the police are taking statements after a pub brawl or something. Well, that's a pretty straightforward sentence. He said that you hit him, but you can modify that by inserting the word only almost anywhere in the sentence, and it completely changes the meaning. Like, only he said that you hit him. Nobody else said that, only he said that. Or he only said that you hit him, and then he said nothing else all evening. Or he said that only you hit him, rather than you and all of your mates. Or he said that you only hit him and didn't do anything more extreme than that. Or he said that you hit him only, because normally you clobber loads of people when you're out drinking, but on this occasion you were really well behaved and you only assaulted one person down the pub, so well done for keeping your violent tendencies in check. If you take this to extremes, in fact, I'm going to take this to extremes, but you can end up with some very odd sentences indeed. So these here in part 8, these are all examples of notices and newspaper headlines and so on, which I've found on the net or in the press, or sometimes people send this kind of stuff to me because they know it appeals to my sense of humor. And a couple of these I saw with my own eyes, actually. So in each case, it's trying to say something fairly sensible, but in reality, the notice or the headline or whatever says something a little bit odd. Depends on how twisted your sense of humor is. So, like the first one, if the baby doesn't like cold milk, boil it. Well, if you boil the baby, it will stop complaining. But I really don't think that's what we mean. So for most of these, I think we can actually just rejig the word order, like boil the milk if the baby doesn't like it cold. But for some of these, that's not going to be enough. For some of these, I think we are going to have to change the vocabulary. So for some of these, it's not just a question of playing around with word order. We're going to have to change the wording as well. So, as before, freeze the program now. Have a look through these. Just decide how you would clarify the meaning, just to make them 100% clear to every single possible reader. And when you unfreeze me, then I'll tell you what I think, but obviously there are variations in the way that you can express things. Okay, so freeze me now, and then unfreeze me when you're ready. Right, I'm officially unfrozen. So the first one I'd suggested, boil the milk if the baby doesn't like it cold. B is a funny one, really. This is obviously a newspaper headline: enraged cow injures farmer with axe. Now, obviously, I don't know what you've done to this, but from running training sessions using this handout, a lot of people go into the passive voice with this one, and I think it's entirely acceptable. I did say that you can use the odd bit of passive. So most people go farmer with axe injured by enraged cow. And I think that is absolutely fine. You can keep it in the active voice, but you then have to change the wording, like enraged cow injures axe wielding farmer or something like that. I mean, I'm assuming that's the way that it went. Yeah, but the passive is okay. I do remember that this was March 2020. This was before Corona hit and we went into our first lockdown. My last face-to-face training delivery was this course up in Manchester. And there was actually a discussion in the room about who was holding the axe. Was it the farmer or was it the cow? I said, how on earth is that even physically possible? I think everyone was getting a little bit frazzled by that point. Right, C looks like a sort of mafia client. My client has discussed your proposal to fill the trench with his family members. It's like a sort of Corleone family bloodletting, and he's going to dismember his family. Yeah, anyway, obviously Acuity is not going to be working for mafioso clients. So we need to move the family members to a different part of the sentence. My client has discussed with his family members your proposal to fill the trench. Now, so far, we've really been rejigging word order, but for D, I think we're going to have to change the wording. This was interesting, really, because when I was in Paris, I mentioned I'd been to Paris to train an in-house legal team there. And when we got to red tape holds up new bridge, a lot of the French lawyers said that that does not compute at all. That what is that nonsense sentence? And in fact, one of them said, "It was like, what is this, like a child's toy bridge being held up with red sticky tape or something?" So two bits of jargon in there: red tape, and then holds up. And the first one, they did understand, red tape. They have a similar expression in French. Very often, continental languages, they have similar expressions for bureaucracy, red tape, or sometimes pink tape. So that did compute, and apparently that stems from the time when Acts of Parliament were published in rolled up scrolls, and the rolled up scrolls were tied together with red tape or pink tape. So that's where that comes from for bureaucracy. Strangely enough, what they did not understand was the phrasal verb holds up new bridge. They interpreted that physically, literally. So I really would change that to a more conventional verb like delays. So either red tape or bureaucracy delays new bridge. And I was surprised at how badly that traveled, actually, but we do use these phrasal verbs a lot. The project has been held up, negotiations have been dragged out unnecessarily, he slagged off my proposals, and so on. You know, they're very expressive, but they don't travel well. So if you are writing internationally, or if you're writing, say, to a client whose first language is not English, maybe use a more conventional verb like delays, the project has been extended, he criticized my ideas, and so on. E probably needs a change of verb there. I think we all know what that means, but something less cannibalistic might be involve your children, not include, but involve your children when baking cakes. Sometimes people suggest bake cakes with your children, but I still think that sounds a bit cannibalistic, quite frankly. F was a newspaper headline. This was on the front page of the Daily Mirror. Now, I wrote these notes years ago, but this now reminds me of, again, first lockdown, Corona lockdown, March 2020. For several months, you had to queue for ages just to get into the supermarket. And so, yeah, two sisters reunited after 18 years at checkout counter. I mean, it did feel that way sometimes. There are two options, really, for clarifying this. You can stick after 18 years at the front. So after 18 years, the two sisters were reunited at the checkout counter, or two sisters reunited at checkout counter after 18 years. So move after 18 years to the back end of the sentence. So it works at the front, it works at the end, but it really doesn't work splicing 18 years into the middle of the sentence because it looks like they're queuing for 18 years. G, stolen paintings found by tree. That's a bit surreal, really, isn't it? It kind of makes it sound as though I've got this magic tree that goes wandering around doing things, which is a bit odd. So I would say stolen paintings found under tree or near tree or close to the tree, or if you're a chartered surveyor, in close proximity to the tree. Remember that word cluster there? Probably under the tree is better. H sounds quite nasty, really. One of the orphanage's biggest supporters was Mary Smith, who donated £10,000 along with her younger son, because he's a revolting child and she can't stand him any longer. That's not very nice, really, is it? And I don't think that's the son's role in this. I think he's a co-donor. So one of the orphanage's biggest supporters was Mary Smith, who, along with her younger son, donated £10,000. And then he'll be sadly missed, said a family member commenting on Lazarus' death for the first time. I did change the name in there, Lazarus. I don't know if you got the New Testament imagery to remember Jesus resurrected Lazarus from the dead. So it kind of suggests it's his death for the first time. So he can die, be resurrected, die, be resurrected. But he gets fed up after that after a while. So I think it's really, he'll be sadly missed, said a family member commenting for the first time on Lazarus' death. So it's the comment that comes for the first time. And then the last one was a sign in Harrods department store. This was a few Christmases ago. We were doing some Christmas shopping, and the sign said, "Public toilet closed, please use floor below." And in training sessions, I always ask people, what do you think I did? And at least one person can be relied on to say, you peed on the floor, which I did not do, I hasten to add. I took the escalator to the next floor down, and I used the toilet on the floor below, just in case you're wondering. Right, so that was a bit of light relief. Now we're going to do some serious work again. As you might have gathered from what I've said now and from the first program, is that I am a bit of a magpie. I find examples of good or generally bad writing and drafting in the press and on the net all the time. So very often if I see something interesting, I'll grab it and use that. But some of this rubbish I have to make up myself. So we have 5 miscellaneous exercises on the last page here. And they're a bit of a mixture. Some of this is real rubbish, and some of this is fictional rubbish that I made up. So have a look at your own downloaded copy, because I can't squeeze everything onto the screen here. So there are 5 exercises, A, B, C, D, E. Some of this is real. Some of this is fictional rubbish. Freeze the program. Just have a little read through and just think to yourself, which ones of these are John's fictional creation? Which are taken from real life documents? Which are real? 1 or 2 of the answers might surprise you. So freeze the program now, and then unfreeze me when you're ready. Okay, 2 of these are mine, and 3 are taken from real life documents. And whenever I ask a group of people in a seminar, which 2 do you think are mine? Mostly people say A and E. A because the second sentence is 52 words long, and E because the language is positively Victorian, items of a disputatious or polemic kind. But they are both real. They are not my creation at all. They are both real. I actually made up B and C. But A appeared on the back page of the Law Society's Gazette a few years ago. The last page of the Law Society's Gazette is a tongue-in-cheek column called Obiter, and it pokes fun at city law firms and eminent judges and so on. And they reproduced A in Obiter and said, this is a real letter written by a partner in a top 20 city law firm. Would you instruct a solicitor who writes rubbish like this? And yeah, that second sentence is 52 words long. I mean, talk about making a mountain out of a molehill. People often ask me if I exaggerate when I talk about how generally grim the standard of business writing is, in business and commerce generally. But I don't think I do exaggerate at all, actually. I mean, the general standard of business writing is positively woeful. So this is an easy win for you. Just follow these guidelines, these plain English guidelines, and you will stand head and shoulders above 90% of the opposition. And then E, I found on a website you might want to have a look at, actually. The website is www.plainenglish.co.uk. And it's the website of the Plain English campaign, which is like a pressure group that tries to get banks, building societies, public sector bodies, and so on to write in plain English, to write in a way that their clientele will understand. And people send them examples of verbose and ridiculous writing, and they publish them anonymously on the website. And then they always offer a plain English redraft. Yes, apparently that's a real letter written by a librarian. So, imagine somebody writing to their local town library, "Dear library, please can we stick up some welfare rights stuff in your entrance area?" And then the chief librarian kind of writes back and is either having some kind of existential midlife crisis or has spent too much time looking through the thesaurus, and we end up with that pretentious rubbish. Okay, so I made up B. B is twice as long as it should be. It is, I believe, 104 words long, and we can get it down to 50, mainly by cutting out the unnecessary repetition, which is prevalent throughout, and also by taking it into the active voice, because it is passive all the way through. C, I made up, it's basically an exercise in tabulation, so the landlord's willing to settle in return for 1, 2, 3, 4, A, B, C, D. And then D is a fairly standard form internal regulation within a public sector body, and setting out the procedure for putting work out to tender to the private sector. And D is actually quite a tricky exercise. My main issue with D is it's got too much information squeezed into this very densely worded paragraph. And a lot of people misinterpret it, actually, in particular the second sentence. So I'm going to deal with the easy ones first, and then I'll move on to the trickier ones afterwards, and save D until last, because it's a lot worse than it looks. Right, so A and E are basically write as you speak. Do you remember from session 1, I said a lot of business writing guides say that for day-to-day correspondence and internal guidance and things like that, write as you speak. What would you say to a client or a colleague over coffee? Well, that's how we ought to be writing it. And we do tend to talk in the active voice rather than the passive and so on. So A, write as you speak. I mean, what we're doing is we're chasing up a missing journal subscription. So I've done this in 19 words. I mean, the whole thing, not just, one sentence, the whole thing in 19 words. So here we go. Sentence 1. We recently subscribed to your journal, but have heard nothing. Full stop. 10 words. Sentence 2. Please confirm receipt and send us the latest issue. 9 words. There you go, 19 words total. I mean, you could take it down to 18. I mean, you could leave out the please, but I like pleases and thank yous. I think people tend to respond well to politeness. So I think I'll go for 19. There you go, whole thing from start to finish. Bonkers. Right, and then E, I very much doubt if it's on the plainenglish.co.uk website anymore, because they obviously refresh it from time to time. But again, it's write as you speak, really. So somebody writes to the local library asking if they can put welfare rights posters and leaflets up in the entrance area. And yeah, I mean, this is clearly somewhat pretentious items of a disputatious or polemic kind. So I'm sure disputatious is a proper word. I mean, spell checker doesn't seem to object to it, but I think I'd probably say controversial and political items or something like that. Anyway, I can pretty much remember the Plain English campaign's redraft, actually, which went along the lines of: thank you for your inquiry about displaying welfare rights materials in our lobby, full stop. Sentence 2, libraries generally display materials from public sector bodies, but we have to consider more controversial or political items individually. Or it could have been case by case, something like that. But again, it's basically write as you speak. And what I just said is about half the length of that as well. Now, getting a little bit more involved, B is, yeah, twice as long as it should be. And I'm going to amend it underneath, actually. Sorry, I'm just going to, there we go. Sorry, I've been blithely assuming I can just splice something in, but anyway, let me just ignore that that numbering that's crept in. Okay, so four sentences. Judge considers application for an injunction, submission by the defendant. This is totally over the top because the relevant clause is already void. Effect of this, you can get full relief without an injunction, or I suppose another way of saying this would be that that damages would provide full relief, and then the court agrees with that submission. So I'm just going to amend, I'm going to redraft it now, and you will see how much shorter the redraft is. So the judge considered the claimant's injunction application. The defendant responded or replied or argued in turn, whatever you want to say, that this was inappropriate since the relevant clause was void, not null and void, just void following an earlier court order. Therefore, the clause had no effect, or you could say was ineffective. And yeah, it says there the defendant argued that full relief could be given without an injunction. Well, you know, the other way of saying this is, therefore, the clause had no effect and damages would provide full relief. And then the court found itself to be in agreement with that submission. The court agreed. And you can see just how much shorter that is. So it's 7 lines down to 3. You know, we've pretty much sliced it in half. Don't know if I can push this in. Let's have a look. There we go. Forgive my somewhat cack-handed typing abilities there. Of course, now Grammar Checker always insists on putting a comma after therefore, but it's not strictly necessary. Anyway, look at that. About less than half the number of words, mainly taking it into the active voice, but then decluttering, avoiding the unnecessary repetition and so on. The next one, before I totally blitz this page with my redraft there, this was exercise C. The landlord is willing to settle this case for. Like I said, this is basically an exercise in tabulation. So the landlord is willing to settle in return for, and then there are 4 items, and the urgency applies to items 2 and 3 because it says the tenant must immediately reinstate the fixtures and fittings and must at once vacate the premises. So immediately, at once, forthwith, like now. And because we are nudging into legal drafting territory, I would use consistent language. And oddly enough, there is an ambiguity in the second sentence on screen there. Further, the landlord insists upon having replaced the false ceiling which was unlawfully removed, the replacement to be at the tenant's expense. Yeah, replaced by whom? Well, that's the passive voice, isn't it? So typically in group seminars, I tend to get a 50-50 split of opinion. So half the people interpret that as just paying the cost of reinstating the false ceiling. The others interpret that as the tenant having to arrange a builder to come in with the landlord's consent and reinstate the false ceiling. And I don't think I can really say which. It's ambiguous. So if you get some ambiguous instructions, flag up the relevant bit, do your first draft, flag up the relevant bit to the client or the partner or whoever is instructing you and say, well, you know, which option did you actually mean? And could you please be clear in your instructions in future? No, actually, probably don't say the last bit. It might not be a good idea in career terms. Right, so tabulated, I would say the landlord is willing to settle this case if the tenant, A, or 1, pays 150 grand to the landlord, B, immediately reinstates the fixtures and fittings, C, immediately then vacates the premises, and then D, either pays for the cost of replacing the false ceiling or arranges for the replacement of the false ceiling, whichever way you jump on the final issue. Now, so the last exercise was exercise D. I'm just going to undo all the butchery that I committed to this page with my ridiculous typing. There you go. So it's now restored into exercise D. And what I'm going to do is I've got a Word document that shows what I would do. Now, like I said, it's got too much information squeezed into it. And in particular, a lot of people misunderstand the second sentence. At least 28 days public notice shall be given in one or more local newspapers, and also where the value of the contract is likely to exceed £150,000 in one or more relevant trade journals. I've seen that expressed more succinctly than that. The point is, it is both and. It's one or more local newspapers, and also, so in addition, for the valuable contracts in the trade press. But a lot of people read it as either or. So less valuable contracts, local press, more valuable contracts, trade press, but that's wrong. It's local press for everything. And then a second additional notice in the trade press for the more valuable contracts. So two options, really. I mean, you could split that into two, which I think works very well, but then in the second sentence I would use a word like also. So for the valuable contracts, notice should also be published in one or more relevant trade journals. Or you could tabulate it, and I like tabulation. I mean, it's just kind of intrinsic to my drafting style, really. So this is what I would do to it. I would tabulate it. But I mean, if you would prefer to split sentence 2 into 2 separate sentences, absolutely fine by me. Absolutely fine. Okay, sentence 1, pretty much as it was. My one little tweak is instead of shall apply, I've said this regulation applies. Anything to do with drafting or quasi-drafting, I tend just to stay in the present tense like that. And then I've tabulated sentence 2. At least 28 days public notice shall be given in A, one or more local newspapers, and B, where the value exceeds this amount in one or more relevant industry journals, or however you want to express that. The point is, it is A and B, so it is both A and B. You'd be staggered by the number of people over the years who've tabulated that, and they've put or A, one or more local newspapers, or where the value exceeds this amount in the trade press. And that's totally wrong, isn't it? It's not or, it is and. And then pragmatically, I've also tabulated the contents of the third and last sentence as well. Each advertisement should set out nature and purpose, where you get more information and so on. I mean, although the original is not a disaster, I could imagine somebody who's tired, frazzled under pressure, they might skim read through it and just miss a bit of information. And if you did publish a tender notice that omitted one of the basic building blocks of information, then I think it might invalidate the whole tender process, actually. So it would be void, or null and void, or ultra vires, whichever expression you prefer. So you see that there on screen now is reader friendly, isn't it? And don't underestimate aids to readability as well. So numbering, line breaks, and then tabulation, of course. That to me is very reader friendly. Whereas the original, which I will call up again, there you go, there's the original, that is not reader friendly at all. that's no, that's awful. So yeah, do bear in mind the presentation on the page. Split the information up, present it clearly for the reader to take in and to assimilate like that. That then brings us to the end of session 2, all about writing skills. Sessions 3 and 4, which I hope and trust I will see you for, are focused on legal drafting skills. Now, we're going to use similar principles, but of course, we're going to apply them much more strictly, because for legal drafting, of course, it's got to be judge-proof. It's got to withstand judicial scrutiny, so it'll be that much more serious an exercise. Anyway, I hope that you have found these tips useful and that you can use them in your day-to-day business correspondence. If you're doing a serious advice letter or something like that in the not too distant future, yeah, definitely use these principles, and good luck. See you for legal drafting. Take care. Bye.